So now I think we're up for our next panel, which is going to be focused on cybersecurity. I happen to be the moderator for that, so I guess I'm going to hang on to the mic. But I just want to invite my panel up on stage. Katie Savage, Secretary of Department of Information and Technology for the state of Maryland. Hey. Brian Wane, the CEO of XQ Message. Mark Wheeler, the CIO of the great city of Philadelphia. And Neal Jardine, Global Cyber Risk Intelligence and Claims Director for BOXX Insurance. Get settled in, everyone. Let me pull up my handy-dandy notes. Because without those, I'm just going to freestyle, and then we're going to be up here for 2 hours. So yeah, let's give a hand to our panel today. So I think our panel, I think we picked like the right time of day to do it, because we've kind of spent the morning talking about how to connect things, how to put data together, how to kind of layer data and share, whether it's interagency or with other companies and organizations, so we can kind of provide a better ecosystem. But I think it's important to really recognize how important it is that all of these things are protected and that we are prepared, and we're not reactive when it comes to protecting data, information, our infrastructure, our grids, et cetera. And so, you know, we assembled a panel today that I think provides a bunch of different perspectives. You've got the municipal perspective, state perspective, but also with the municipal background and industry perspective, because, you know, Smart City Council, we're about everyone at the table and everyone in the discussion. So I think it's important. So I kind of prepared a little abstract just to kind of guide the conversation. So here it goes. So as our world becomes increasingly connected through technology, the importance of cybersecurity and preparedness for companies and governments in today's digital age can't be overstated. I think the amount of data and information that is flowing through our ecosystems, enabled by next-gen connectivity, has increased data, and cyber attacks are on the rise. So as businesses and individuals alike must be diligent in protecting themselves from potential breaches. So this roundtable, again, is going to discuss that in depth with our experts, challenges, best practices, and things that everyone needs to do to prepare for the constant threat. And one thing to recognize that as technology evolves, so does cyber criminals. Our systems are sophisticated, their systems are sophisticated, so it's not like, you know, I think when you think of a cyber criminal, when, you know, in the general term, the public just kind of thinks of like this little grimy guy behind a computer, you know, trying to hack into your email. And these people are developing technology at the pace that we are, and so I think it's important that we face it head on, and we better prepare our organizations and cities. So, that being said, the first thing that I want to open up the discussion with is obviously, you know, I want to kind of work our way down. We can start with Mark and work our way down, but, you know, what today is keeping you up at night, either because you're excited or you're freaking out about our cyber posture and the way that we're preparing today. So Mark, we'll start with you and just work our way down.
Sure. Hey, good morning. Thanks for having us here, Alby. I have no end of things that I worry about because I'm just genetically, predisposed to worry all the time. But from the city's perspective, I'd like to give you a little bit of background on why I worry about this now. When I started my role as CIO at the very beginning of 2018, within a couple of months, it was very apparent to me that as a city government, at that time, Philadelphia was not doing what it needed to do in terms of cybersecurity and then data privacy protections. And by May, the individual who was my CISO had walked in my office and said, "I'm resigning." I said, "Oh, okay. How long are you going to give me?" He said, "The next hour." Which I immediately took to mean we are in the middle of a cyber attack and he wants out and doesn't want to have any culpability. That wasn't true, but within days, his team began to resign, and the reality was we didn't have a cybersecurity program. We had a firewall program. The city was putting all of its effort on strictly a firewall. I'm very happy to say that we now are a program with investigative response and 24-hour monitoring and a SIM and multi-factor authentication and all of the things that you need to be doing, including a cyber awareness program, and then multiple types of layering on top of that, like our SSL injection that we have through a new proxy, and using some of the alerting and threat investigations that you can get now with the 24/7 monitoring on the EDR tools. But what keeps me up at night is now this is a constant battle with entities that are both individuals who have the time on their hands to hack, but mostly organized crime, in my view, and from some of the briefings that I've been getting, it's organized crime and then nation-state attacks, which it requires a coordinated set of responses, not just from city or federal government, but with our supply chain. So if we go back to 2020 and early 2021, we saw the first systemic supply chain attacks on software systems that were critical to our operations in governments. You know, SolarWinds being one of them, Microsoft had some intrusions, and there are others. How we respond to that is incredibly challenging, and I don't feel comfortable with just doing SOC 2 reports as part of our cybersecurity reviews for any new procurements that we make or solutions that we're getting. I don't know if that gives me enough confidence that if another solution provider is hacked in a way that now my permitting system or my tax information system and payment systems now go online, how do I respond to that? That's a whole level of resilience that we should be preparing for as governments. You'll see that in the continuity plans. What happens if this goes down? What I'm saying is I don't know if I could recover it if that system is so corrupt and hacked. How do I recover something that I have to rely on somebody else's complete software platform to do? And also if there's been an exposure of privacy data, which I'm extremely concerned about, and I'll wrap this up quickly. I think the naivete that comes with the smart city conversations about privacy. Smart cities is my thing. I lead a CIO on smart cities and intelligent infrastructure, and I think that the community is not addressing the privacy concerns well enough. And that's the thing that one keeps me up at night, and then the accelerating pace of the attacks infiltrating our software supply chain.
Thanks, Mark.
Well, Mark, thank you for sharing that. It makes me feel better coming in as a relatively new CIO to know that I'm not alone. So I'm Katie Savage. I recently became the state CIO for Maryland. Before that, I ran the Defense Digital Service at the Department of Defense. Before that, which is how I got to know Alby, I created the City Tech Collaborative in Chicago. So what keeps me, the question of what keeps me up at night, there's at least two pieces of it. One, coming from the Department of Defense, I led a lot of the work of our team during Operation Warp Speed, which was the federal government's creation or investment in creating a vaccine. And where we were involved from the DoD's perspective was bringing cybersecurity to bear on that. So a lot of what Mark spoke about with regard to the supply chain, fell under us, and that to me was really eye-opening. When we think about DoD, we have some cybersecurity, tons of cybersecurity resiliency and measures in place when we think about the traditional defense industrial base, those companies that we know are investing in us. But during Operation Warp Speed, we added, as Mark was saying, all of those companies that were part of the supply chain. So we were adding vaccine companies, we were adding those who, the trucks that were delivering them, we were adding the pharmacies, sort of this much larger footprint. And when I think about now my role at the state of Maryland, there's sort of that footprint is very, when we think about the expansion of the footprint, it's very similar. The previous presenter was just talking about microgrids. We just passed a bill to increase our clean energy investment, including microgrids, and so that's an expansion of the footprint that we need to think about from a cyber perspective. So I guess I have the paranoia of what it looks like, at DoD when you expand the sort of remit, when you expand your remit to include things that are important to us as a society, but that also means increased cybersecurity measures that and risks and opportunities. So that's one. And the second, similar to what Mark was saying, when I stepped in as CIO, what my observation has been is that the sort of security side of the house is a little bit divorced from our operating side of the house. on the one hand, we have a lot of really interesting investments, and we just created a special, SOC, Special Operations Center. We just did a major CrowdStrike implementation, which has already proved to be extremely effective. But that's, sort of external facing, facing outward to the other agencies, state agencies. I'm not sure that there's as strong of a connection as there should be to, the operating side of the house. So, how does what our CISO look at inform identity and access management, or endpoint protection, or even asset management? You can't protect what you can't measure, what you're not aware of. And so one of my challenges coming in as CIO is how do we bridge the gap between those two things? The CTO has to be able to, in our organization, has to be able to account for all of the different endpoints that we have in order for something like CrowdStrike to be effective. So it's those types of things. Or, we stood up the SOC, and to Mark's point, I'm not totally sure that we've done an inventory of all the state's critical assets to make sure that the SOC it would be something that the features of our SOC would be able to actually detect. So for me, the biggest challenge and what's keeping me up at night is making sure that we're not just buying a bunch of software and tooling discreetly as part of our cybersecurity remit for the other state agencies, but that it also informs what we're building and buying to be able to deploy from an enterprise standpoint. So I'll pause there, but those are the two issues that are keeping me up.
Great, thanks, Katie. Brian?
Yeah, very much in line with what these two have said as well. But I think that we're focused on the wrong thing. A city isn't just a community. It's not just a platform. It's an ecosystem. Same thing with the state and the rest of it. And those ecosystems have their own little silos, and the gaps between those can be a big problem. So if you're protecting the perimeter, if you're just thinking about how people get in, there's a huge attack surface there. Protecting the data itself is incredibly important, and as part of that, privacy, it comes out as a natural concern that I don't think is really privacy and transparency for the community itself and what's happening to their data and how their data is being used. And then just the acceleration of the attacks on the infrastructure were incredibly, the pandemic changed a lot, right? I think last year, US moved a destroyer towards Taiwan, and one of the Chinese officials said, "Do you just want us to turn out the lights in Macon?" Turn out the lights in a city. So the power is infrastructure, the communication infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure. It's all incredibly vulnerable, and it's there right now, and it's becoming more vulnerable as we get more green because the data is moving in both directions, right? And then also during the pandemic, previous to that, you didn't see really as many ransomware attacks on critical infrastructure, specifically like hospitals, because you'd think that, they thought that there'd be like an overwhelming show of force, like guns and goggles dropping in to stop somebody if they did that. That didn't happen. So now you're seeing an amazing rise in the attacks on critical infrastructure, and specifically ransomware as well, against things like airports and hospitals and all the things that we need. So what is it, like nine meals till we just that thin layer of civility just evaporates. So we need power, we need food, we need water, we need communications and comms to maintain this. And all those are incredibly vulnerable right now. And it's because of the glacial pace of change, specifically around cyber.
Got it. Thanks. Neal?
I'll repeat Mark's thing. My job is effectively just being nervous and worried all the time. So as the claims director of BOXX, my job is effectively to help all of our clients when they do have a cyber attack. So I'll give a positive and a negative, what keeps me up and what makes me excited. So what makes me excited is insurance driving change. So 2016, when I started doing cyber insurance, you could buy a cyber insurance policy if you owned a computer. That was basically their question. One question, do you own a computer? How much do you want as a limit? Go ahead, you got it. Nowadays, there's a bunch of requirements in order to get it, right? What is your security posture? Do you have MFA? Do you understand what's on your network? Have you implemented a lot of controls, right? And then we'll give you insurance. And I love the fact that people are talking about supply chain, because a lot of that is driven by supply chain risks that people are identifying. So if you want to log in and work with my city, you have to have insurance. And in order to get insurance, you have to comply with all these conditions. And so insurance is really driving change and driving, I guess, the requirement and the increased requirement for security controls. And I love it. The analogy I always give is seatbelts in a car. You know, we wouldn't have seatbelts unless it was for insurance. People say, I don't want to do MFA. It takes too long. The exact same argument was made around seatbelts. I'm hopping in my car and I'm getting back out. I don't have time to put my seatbelt on. MFA, same idea. Yes, it's an extra step, takes 2 seconds, but we're all going to get used to it and stuff, and that's awesome. So I really, positive side, insurance driving change, which I love. Thing that keeps me up at night, which makes me a bit paranoid, is when we finally have the cyber catastrophic event. So SolarWinds, those large events that take down multiple, thousands of businesses at the same time. At some point, we are going to have a cyber event that takes down either an entire, state, country, something. And it's going to be overwhelming for us, and that's what keeps me up. So if you look, some insurers have actually started looking at it like a flood policy, and they've said, if you want to buy a cyber catastrophe or a widespread event, you need to buy that as an additional coverage. Whereas others have said, okay, we have it baked into ours, we'll just cover you for a widespread event. But others have started separating it. So I think as we start to mature and become further along with insurance, the part that scares me is, when does that massive event happen? And are we as an industry, insurance and non-insurance, prepared to handle every single one of our clients phoning us and saying, I'm down, what do I do?
Awesome. So I think traditionally, cities, people, industry, et cetera, have been pretty reactive to cyber attacks and to any kind of cyber incident that happens. There's a lot that we've learned from that. And so what are some things that we could do? And maybe we'll start with you, Katie, and then maybe Mark, if you can chime in from a city's perspective and industry supporting that. It's just what are some proactive strategies that we can take that are simple, that will disrupt attack cycles, that will disrupt kind of any disruptions in that. What are some things we can do?
Well, when I was at DoD, we had the opportunity, because of the pandemic, to think about the work from home and remote environment. And I think we've all largely settled into some kind of hybrid, remote and in person. And I think there's an opportunity to make sure that we don't lose, to back up. So during the pandemic, because we were partly a cyber team, had this panic moment of what are the measures that we have in place to protect our fleet, essentially our device fleet, and we had a team of 80 people around the world on various networks. Obviously, always had their own endpoint, but we didn't really have good cyber hygiene in place in terms of MFA, endpoint security, even things like, we didn't have a protective DNS service, things like that. So we took the opportunity during the pandemic, knowing that everyone was on their own network, to put those measures in place. And I saw a lot of that over the past years, and I feel like some of that is starting to fade as we've accepted this as a new reality. So I would encourage us to act as though we're still in the middle of the pandemic from that perspective, and think about, again, how are we at a minimum thinking about our workforce, knowing that we're continuing to be distributed and hybrid, and thinking about the basic, if you have a fleet of Macs, like what, are you taking advantage of Apple Business Manager? There's some very basic things like that. CrowdStrike, looking at sort of endpoint, malicious activity, and anomaly detection. DNS, I think, is another one. There's often, you can couple your VPN with, with how you're thinking about, a DNS service, for example. So I think one thing that cities and state can do is, at a minimum, look at the attack surface that the workforce is creating. So that's one. The second is all of that data that comes from those services is something that I think is a really great opportunity. And Mark mentioned how we can better partner with federal and sort of the intelligence community, but it starts with sort of basic data analysis that we can do from all of that traffic. If you're able to look at your own DNS traffic, for example, it's I will often bash artificial intelligence, but that actually is good for being sort of not appropriately utilized and just kind of a buzzword, but that actually is a really good use of AI. If you are able to look at the data, analyze the traffic, you can start to actually create threat models. Where is this? Where are the threat actors coming from, for example? So I think we'd be remiss if we didn't, in parallel to rolling out some of these tools, think about the data that we're collecting and what can tell us about either from the one end of the extreme to where there are perhaps nation-state actors to what is where is there a particular in my case county that we're seeing a lot of malicious activity happening. So that's the second piece, and the third, like we were saying earlier, is prioritizing critical assets. Again, I think a lot about all of the vendors and the software that we have at our disposal. And I think about how do we prioritize, what is something, we were mentioning hospitals and microgrids and prisons. What are the things that we have to have a no-fail situation, and prioritizing those in terms of the cybersecurity tools that we're rolling out.
Want to chime in on that, Mark?
Sure. I definitely love the comment, Katie, about this is actually a good use of AI, because that abnormal communication monitoring is one of the reasons that we've been able to stop very significant attacks in the city. So my recommendation is from 3 experiences. Real world, it would have shut down in one case it would have shut down our fire department, which we did have to take down for up to 5 days, and they had to go to business continuity because we just needed to make sure there was no lurking secondary attack in a system. Another in a court system that took it down for 3 months and slowed down some of the economic activity in the city because they were not able to process real estate transactions for a time being. And what the reasons that those attacks were not any worse than they were is because we had the anomaly detection running, and someone got an alert and knew immediately on the networking team, now our what we call our ITCC, IT Command Center, which is a version of a NOC, a Network Operations Center, that has some Security Operations Center capabilities. They reacted to it, shut down communications, shut down the servers. The machines had already been infected, though, so you had to not just clean and re-image, we had to rebuild entire application stacks in the court system with a vendor. With the fire department, it came down to one thing only: cybersecurity awareness training. The event happened like this. In the morning, in a very specific office, a worker saw a blue screen on their machine, tried to get into their file sets, noticed that all of the files had now a very weird extension on them. That person, because of cyber awareness training, got off a call to the IT help center and said, I think that there might be an attack going on or something. I don't know, but I thought I saw this in training, that when you see weird changes like this, like systemic changes, I needed to notify you. Within minutes, that had gotten up the chain, and we quarantined that subnet. And it was only because of that worker. I mean, maybe we would have gotten it sooner, but what if those machines had started communicating and maybe we had missed it in the threat monitoring or detection? Because this happened to be in a remote field office with devices that were connecting to the internet, and that's how it got in. It got in through an air card that we didn't. Visibility is one big problem CIOs and CISOs have. If we don't have visibility, we can't stop the problem. We don't know how to correct it. So in the ecosystem issue that was mentioned, that becomes a very big threat factor too, is just having visibility. But I'll bring it back into the number one thing you can do is keep your people trained and update that training. If you're telling them the same thing year after year after year, you're not helping yourself, because we incorporated the blue screen of, wasn't the blue screen of death, but it was a similar type of training, made it very explicit, like when you see these changes to your file names, that means something bad. Stop, drop, and roll, basically, and stop and keep screaming until someone shows up to to do something. And the other one we're now going to have to incorporate is about chatbots and the different types of LLMs that are out there, because people are just naively putting anything in the chat, including PII or HIPAA data, just because the AI is there to help us. And the reality is, it's an unsupervised channel, it's an encrypted channel. We know human beings could possibly be looking at it. We know it's being used in the large language model itself. We don't know how well it's being anonymized, and we don't know how any of those channels could be hacked because we don't have visibility on it itself. So that's, again, your training has to get updated constantly, and you need to require it. And if anyone's outstanding more than 60 days after taking the training, you need to give them a reprimand, and they should have been cut off within 30 days.
So I do want to double click on training and education, but I just want to check, Brian or Neal, if you want to chime in on some of these practices or anything. But
I'm happy to echo training. We have like 90 modules, I think, in 15 different languages, and we push training. If somebody came to me and said, I want cyber insurance, I'd look at them and say, okay, do you have training? Do you have patch management? Critical 14 days, non-critical 30. Do you have MFA on everything? And the Cadillac, or not Cadillac, would be an EDR or XDR type tool in place. You had those, I'd write you pretty much all day. But if you said to me, I don't have training, but I got MFA, it doesn't matter to me because they'll get around it in a second, right? So training's a huge component. It's kind of one of the items you need in order to do it. And I think part of that training comes down to as well helping smaller municipalities or smaller cities, because larger cities and municipalities have a lot of like the big teams of people, and they have a lot of people to resource and stuff. But sometimes you get the smaller city, the smaller municipality, where it's the same person who's been in that role for 30 years. They learned Nortel networks back in the day, and that dating myself. And so they've kept to that same level, and they haven't really gone out for courses because the city doesn't have the 10 grand in training budget. I always make the joke that nobody does a ribbon cutting ceremony in an email server room, right? It's always to build a new park, right? Imagine going on the model of I'm going to update security, everyone, but nobody gets a new park for the next 3 years. You're not going to get voted in, right? So the idea is to not let those smaller cities get left behind, and I think that comes down to training, awareness, bringing everyone along with us, because obviously they're just going to be the other analogy I use is running from a bear, right? If all the big cities are the fastest runners, all the small cities are the ones that are going to sustain the attacks. It's not good for the economy because they're going to be somehow connected to everybody else, right? So everyone's got to run from the bear really quickly and let the other countries be the slow runners. So,
if I can create a little bit of controversy here.
Oh.
Training, absolutely important, have to do it, but people are the biggest problem.
Yeah.
And they're always going to make a mistake. There's no way to stop that, right? You need real-time data governance at the data level. Encrypt, track, log, everything that happens, every single data access, not just at the network level, but at the data level. And then also, to your point on recovery, don't just have the plan, test the plan. Test the plan regularly, everywhere. Back it up, because inevitably you'll be like, we have the plan. Has anyone done it? No. So, or when you go through it the first time, you'll be like, oh, we missed this whole other thing that's going to keep us locked out for the next 3 months or something. It happens all the time.
Yeah, and don't forget to print your plan out and put it on your desk, because it's no good on your computer if it's encrypted.
That is an excellent point. The red binder. That's
Yeah,
on the,
exactly. The only piece of paper you're going to see in an IT office.
So maybe just to even dive deeper into the topic of education, training, and awareness. So the people sitting on this stage, you guys are experts. You kind of know what you're doing. But then how do you make sure, besides just jamming it in people's faces, but how do you ensure that the end user kind of understands their role and responsibility and protection? How do you incorporate that into not just your training and education, but your standards of best practice and the things that you enforce? How do you make sure that brand new 3 months on the job analyst at the Department of Permitting or Buildings kind of understands what their role is in that ecosystem and in protecting the information for their city?
You make it systemic, and we've done it in Philadelphia. We've done it through a pillar that I call like guidance and guardrails, because when I took over as CIO, one of the pieces of feedback I would get from members of the ecosystem was, Mark, we just really need to know what the standards are, and we could do some of this work ourselves. We don't always have to put in the request. We have some capabilities. And I realized that we, didn't have any alignment to NIST policies, and we needed to get dozens and dozens of more policies written, but then the procedures written that impacted those systems. In that process, I was able to engage like the entire organization. And in the policy writing and then the procedures writing, and in fact, we're still doing procedures writing because we always find gaps. But we also then restructured how we took in project requests and evaluations and procurement requests for SaaS solutions. So that all goes through a structured architecture and security review. That has been a very, very painful process because we've had to iterate and learn and it was overly complicated, which is where all the security folks, no offense, want to go sometimes. It's always no, no, no. And I had to change that to, our job is to get to yes. It's how we get there and what risk we're willing to accept or I'm willing to sign off on with my business partners. That has trained everyone across the board, I feel, in the IT organization, from software developers to UX designers to now, and our smart city folks, to be aware of the conversations that need to be had when projects are in front of them, when they're conceiving of the projects, and when they're procuring. I heard a comment earlier today in the conversation where someone said, is that secure? And they said, yes, it's secure by design, and then they moved on. And I would hope that my people would want to really interrogate that statement and look for some very specifics that come back to our NIST control families. The other piece of it is that you have to have, and I've been very lucky to get the buy-in of leadership in the organization. They've encouraged me to speak about it. We do the cyber awareness. I do regular briefings at a leadership level on a monthly frequency, and then as needed for the rest of the community, but at least once a year. And when Ukraine started, I immediately had briefings with select portfolios to explain what the risks that we thought were coming and how they needed to prepare. And then that leads to people thinking for themselves, thankfully. And then, fraud detection and a fraud policy started to get developed in other departments, and they started to do their own trainings that were much more specific to some of the issues that they would get because they manage bank accounts and ACH payments and the like. So it happens systemically if you approach it that way.
Along the lines of taking a systemic approach, we conduct a cyber assessment of every single agency for the state. And it's been a huge undertaking. This is the first time we've done it, and so it's not perfect yet. But we use the NIST control framework to assess sort of the individual, a threat surface of each agency, and then we are in the middle now, because it's the first year we've done it, of briefing those agencies. And that process has also given us some insight. Not all, and those of you who are in city or state government can appreciate, not all agencies are the same. You have the health department, for example, which has their own CISO and their own CIO, and a more sophisticated team to be able to look at our assessment and remediate as appropriate. But then it sort of surfaces, again, me as a new CIO, some of the agencies that have no IT staff, and that's an opportunity for DoIT, for Maryland's IT department to work with them to, they might be, an agency of 10 people, but they're running, I'll pick on like veterans benefit system. They're running something that, is hugely vulnerable. So, I agree with Mark that a systemic approach to assessments is really important, and something that we're embarking on at Maryland, not only so that we understand, the cyber, we can understand and help agencies understand their cybersecurity risk, but also where we can kind of shore up with additional resources some of those agencies that are lacking in IT support. You're mentioning as well security controls. So we legislatively, it's interesting, in Maryland, DoIT is the front door for all major IT projects. We have a governance and oversight role. And I think the approach right now, we're trying to find the right balance between not not sort of encumbering them with a monstrous ATO process, which is really difficult to implement and to monitor, but trying to think through what are some ways we can automate security controls, and or sometimes there is with some of some SaaS products there are some inherent security controls, and it's about the configuration. So how can we add more security engineers and security architects and expertise on our team so that we can help agencies understand the trade-off, and where appropriate sort of require that more thorough security architecture review, and where we can say this is a plugin, we've had to a website, we've had a security engineer look at this, we feel good about this, let's move on. So figuring out how to do that in a way that gets our products into the hands of the agencies very quickly, while still maintaining good cyber posture is a big task at hand that we're looking at as we look to support some of the major IT implementations across the state.
And then Neal and Brian, so how do you see your role in supporting those efforts and kind of supporting agency-wide or company-wide policies and programs?
Well, first of all, we're totally in alignment around the framework in NIST. Like everything we do is built around NIST, especially because HIPAA, FINRA, CMMC, ITAR, GDPR, everything is basically an iteration of that. So having that common framework that everyone can go back to and check the list, check each one of those. Yes.
Check a box.
There we go. And then also the automation, the ability to make it transparent as much as possible. Because again, people will make mistakes. How do you stop them from doing that? And also, how do you create awareness and visibility into the data, not only in real time into what is in your network, but as it leaves your network and with your vendors and other folks like that? How do you have some sort of control over that, and governance over that data when it's not within your immediate control?
I think so one of the lessons we learned was don't make people afraid to ask questions or seek help. So one of the things I learned was 2016 when I started doing cyber events. All I've done since then is handled cyber breaches. So I've seen tons of them. And some of the lessons we learned very early was our biggest cyber breaches were because people didn't phone us. Because you're an insurance company and people are worried if I phone you, I'm making a claim. If I make a claim, my premium goes up and maybe you deny coverage and so on. So I don't want to reach out to the insurance company, scary. So one of the things we did was we actually separated kind of the idea of making a claim and the idea of just reaching out and asking for help. So we launched a group called Hackbusters where effectively our clients can phone in anytime they want, ask us the dumbest, most ridiculous question or the most complex question. And then at the end of the call, we say, great, do you want to make a claim or do you want to just hang up and go about your day? And they make that decision. And we learned last year that 80% of our events got solved in that time frame. So actually we have now started offering that kind of helpline to groups that can't get insurance. So if you talk to gambling houses, they can't get cyber insurance, they're very high risk, but they need just someone to, let me bounce an idea off you. Do I have to notify anyone? What are my requirements? Is this a big event? Is this a small event? And so we've really found that's helped a lot because people are scared to phone and scared to put their hand up. And what ends up happening is I find out after I've spent $500,000 on a ransomware investigation that this could have been completely avoided if they just weren't afraid to phone me or to forward the email with the link they clicked that they closed really quickly, and we're hoping that it just disappeared, right? So making people not afraid to ask questions or seek help, I think is probably the biggest part to go along with everything else.
Yeah. Sometimes the solution is simple, right? So maybe before we end, I want to close with, I think, Mark, you mentioned AI chatbots now kind of being an issue, but what are some issues or opportunities that you see emerging, either new technologies or new solutions that are kind of being presented now that we think that we either need to be aware of or that we can leverage, and you can respond to that. You can choose your own adventure on that two-part question. Maybe we'll work our way down and close it out. Yeah?
Sure. Right. I'll pivot on that a little bit and talk about when I said the smart city, like naivete piece of it around the IoT devices. There's a lot of efforts by major cities across the world to get their hands around data standards and promote strong data standards. But I think a lot of that is not rooted in mechanisms that are enforceable, GDPR being different, and the state of California's data protection program. What I'm thinking of is an analogy is back when Uber and Lyft were taking off and we started to see the scooters proliferate, the Limes and all of that. LA County Transportation, planted a sword in the ground and said, we want that data because mobility data is important and we need to be able to make decisions around it. And the mobility data coming from cabs isn't enough. There's clearly things that we're going to need from the Ubers and the Lyfts and from these micro-mobility providers. And they were very resistant. And what LA County did was legally, used every mechanism that they had to bring them to the table for a conversation and would bar their operations if need be. So there was an economic interest with a city that was very car dependent to do this work. Now the Open Mobility Foundation is the beneficiary of that, and we have this open mobility standard that they promote, and we have other new standards that keep coming out, like curbside management standards and what that data looks like. What I think we need is another city. Philadelphia is not quite right for this yet, but maybe another big city, or maybe under the next mayor and city council, we could get someone to put that sword in the ground and say, for IoTs operating and in buildings, all of the smart sensors that are going on, all of the smart building that's going on, we're going to require, and we're going to work together to get that building information to the city in a secure, anonymized way, so when we need first responders, we'll know where they can go, we'll have information about occupancy that's in real time and by floor. And that technology already exists. There's great companies out there like Area 20 that is using your AP devices to basically map and track just the movement of individuals anonymously. So from a space planning and emergency response incident, like in a school shooting, we would know where those kids are congregating and where there's movement happening. And that's where we should be putting, the effort in the evacuation and then response. I say all of that because we don't have that standard and we don't have the requirement yet or the leverage by which a building management company or building owners would feel comfortable about that. And I do recognize that there is an imposition on privacy there. Like who's in the building when and by what floor could say a lot about business activity or individuals. That's why I say we need to work it out and it needs to be regulated and we need to have ways to monitor it and then we can promote that across the country. But someone's got to do that. And I think digital twins, you're going to have that conversation later today. I think digital twins have a complete negative space in them because the buildings are just blank spots. And you need the live information from the buildings about occupancy and, maybe at some point like hazardous material locations, especially in warehouse fires, you need that information as well.
Got it. Thanks, Mark. Anyone want to share thoughts? No?
Sure. No, for me, when I look at, I'll go back to, I think there's huge opportunity again, and if we think about things like clean energy and microgrids. When I was at DoD, we had a partnership with in partnership with the Army, we were looking at how vulnerable microgrids are. And if anyone goes to DEF CON if anyone goes to DEF CON or is part of that community, and so the world's largest hacking community in Vegas, we had a 12-year-old girl who was able to exploit the microgrid by injecting false weather data, which is like a huge eye-opener. It's surprisingly not hard. So there are things like that I see both, especially when we're talking about big infrastructure projects. And we have to think about this in terms of retrofitting legacy infrastructure as well. Things like utilities are something that we need to think more about how we're retrofitting them with better monitoring capabilities. But as we go forward, and as increasingly we're thinking about climate change and how we have an opportunity to better manage our energy, we're building a lot of this infrastructure from scratch. And the Army, for example, plans to convert all of its grids or all of its domestic bases to microgrids over the next 10 years. So, I think there's, and likewise, cities, are another example. I'm glad the Army is doing that, and cities should be doing that as well because it does promote more resiliency. But the flip side as if we don't get it right in terms of cybersecurity, we could also be putting ourselves hugely at risk. So, as a state CIO, I feel like it's a big role of mine to sort of champion that in terms of the large infrastructure projects we intend to take on.
Brian?
State and federal funding will be tied to citizen data privacy and to compliance. So CMMC, which is the cyber maturity model that the DoD has adopted for everyone that wants to do business with them, that is being adopted as CMMI in DHS and DISA. That will flow down to all critical infrastructure, hospitals, airports, power, transportation, right? In addition to this, in November, the DoD updated their zero trust framework to move from beyond zero trust network access to zero trust data access. Everyone that wants to qualify for those funds and be compliant is going to need to be so compliant by 2027. Get ahead of that, invest in the future, future-proof your technology and your cyber decisions now so that you will be ready for those funding opportunities in the future.
Great. Bring us home, Neal.
A lot of pressure. I think for us, it's really about taking the data we get from all of our customers, right? So we get the benefit of seeing, hundreds of thousands of companies and how they get attacked, what's successful and what's not successful and why. So we track, when were they first notified or when did they become aware of the event? When did the event actually happen? How did they get in? What would have stopped it? What would have avoided it and so on? Now that's very reactive in a way because, they've already been attacked and the attack vector changes and stuff, but it also gives us a lot of insight into what that happened. So I think it's taking that data and sharing it with our partners, which is what we already do, certainly across our customers, and we notify them, we start seeing trends and stuff. So I think it's just about sharing that more broadly as well and just making sure other people have it, because the part that just brings me to tears is when I see the same attack vector that I saw in 2017 still being used on customers nowadays, and I'm like, why didn't you close that? And he's like, I didn't know. And I'm like, well, how did you not know? And he's like, I'm busy doing my job. I don't have time to read security bulletins and update it. Well, hang on, let's give you something that's very simple. Do these 3 things, you're good. So I think it's just about looking at that data, sharing it with others, and making sure we bring everybody along on the security roadmap, and don't leave the small guys behind.